I attended my own funeral, and what I discovered there changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the people I trusted most. My name is Margaret Cole, I'm 71 years old, and this is the story of how I faked my death to expose the biggest betrayal of my life. When I walked into that funeral home 3 days after my supposed death, and saw my husband David laughing with my best friend Claire, while my casket sat empty just 15 feet away, I knew that every suspicion I'd had for the past 6 months was true, but I also knew that what I was about to do would either be the most brilliant move of my life or the most catastrophic mistake I could ever make. It all started 6 months earlier on a Tuesday morning when I came home early from my volunteer shift at the library because I'd forgotten my reading glasses. And as I walked through the front door of the house David and I had shared for 43 years, I heard something that made my blood run cold. His laugh, but not the laugh I'd heard 10,000 times before. This was different, younger somehow, more alive, coming from upstairs in our bedroom, and when I quietly climbed those stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest, I saw through the crack in the door something I can never unsee. My husband of 43 years in bed with Claire Morrison, my best friend since college, the woman who'd been maid of honor at our wedding, the woman I'd confided in about everything, the woman I'd held when she cried about her divorce. And now here she was in my bed with my husband looking happier than I'd seen her look in years. That I didn't scream. I didn't burst in. I didn't collapse. Instead, I backed away silently down those stairs, got in my car, and drove to the park where David and I had our first date back in 1979, and I sat there on that same bench we'd sat on when we were young and full of dreams, and I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to cry and beg and ask why. I was going to find out the truth, the whole truth, about how long this had been going on and what else they'd been hiding from me, because something in my gut told me this wasn't just about an affair. There was something bigger, something darker. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective in my own life. I installed a small recording device in David's car that I ordered online. I set up a hidden camera in our living room disguised as a decorative clock. I started checking our bank statements meticulously, something I'd never done before because I'd always trusted David completely, and what I found made me realize that the affair was just the beginning. David had been slowly draining our joint accounts, transferring money to an account I didn't know existed. He'd taken out a second mortgage on our house without telling me. He'd borrowed against my life insurance policy, and in one particularly damning recorded conversation I overheard in his car, he told Claire that once I was gone they could finally be together and live off everything I'd worked for my entire life. Once I was gone, those 3 words echoed in my head for days. Did he mean when I died naturally, or was he planning something more sinister? I'd recently been diagnosed with high blood pressure and had started taking medication that David always made sure to hand me every morning with a glass of orange juice. And suddenly I started wondering if there was something more than just my prescribed pills in those capsules he gave me so carefully each day. I took one of my pills to a pharmacist friend in the next town over, someone David didn't know, and asked her to test it. And when she called me 2 days later, her voice was shaking. "Margaret," she said, "there's something in this that shouldn't be there. It's not enough to kill you immediately, but over time, over months, it would weaken your heart significantly. You need to go to the police right now." But I didn't go to the police because I had a better idea, an idea so audacious that even I couldn't quite believe I was considering it. But the more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. I was going to fake my own death. I was going to stage it so perfectly that everyone, especially David and Claire, would believe I was really gone. And then I was going to attend my own funeral and see what they did when they thought no one was watching. See what they said when they thought I could never hear them again. And most importantly, record everything so I'd have proof not just of the affair, but of the attempted murder and the financial fraud. I knew it was crazy. I knew it was risky. I knew that if I failed I might end up looking like a deranged old woman. But I also knew that if I succeeded I would expose them completely and get justice not through confrontation or lawyers or messy divorce proceedings, but through their own words and actions when they thought they'd won. I spent the next 2 weeks planning everything meticulously. First, I needed a death that would seem natural given my age and my high blood pressure diagnosis. A heart attack in my sleep would be perfect. Then I needed a doctor who would sign the death certificate without too many questions, and I found one, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, an old friend from my nursing days who I trusted completely, and who, when I told her everything, agreed to help me. She was horrified by what David had done and wanted to see justice served as much as I did. Next, I needed to disappear for a few days. I needed somewhere to stay where David wouldn't find me, where I could monitor everything remotely, and my sister Janet, who lives 2 hours away in Philadelphia, agreed to let me stay with her. She thought I was absolutely insane, but she also knew that I wasn't the type of person to do something like this unless I was absolutely certain, and when I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, the recordings, the bank statements, the poison medication, she understood why I needed to do this. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. On Saturday night, I would take the medication David gave me as usual, but I'd already switched the poison pills with regular ones. Then I'd go to bed at my usual time around 10 o'clock. But at 11, when David always went downstairs to have his nightcap and watch the news, I would sneak out through the bedroom window. Something I'd practiced twice already to make sure I could do it quietly. I'd climb down using the trellis weed installed years ago when we were planning to grow roses, which we never did, and I'd have my car parked 2 blocks away where David couldn't see it from the house. I'd drive to Janet's place. An early Sunday morning she would call David pretending to check on me because she'd had a bad dream about me. And when he went upstairs to check on me, he'd find me gone but my phone still on the nightstand, my medication bottle still on the dresser, and what would look like signs of a struggle, pillows on the floor, bedsheets pulled aside, and Dr. Hendricks would arrive within the hour, examine the scene, and based on my age, my medical history, my high blood pressure, and the evidence of distress, she would pronounce that I'd likely had a massive heart attack, probably got up disoriented, possibly fell, and my body would need to be taken to the morgue for examination. But here's where it got clever. Dr. Hendricks would arrange for the body to be transported to a funeral home run by another friend of hers, someone who was also in on the plan, and that funeral home would prepare a closed casket, claiming that the condition of the body after the heart attack and the fall made an open casket unsuitable, which wasn't unusual for someone my age who'd died suddenly. The funeral would be scheduled for 3 days later, Wednesday afternoon, which would give David and Claire just enough time to think they'd gotten away with it, just enough time to let their guard down, just enough time to start planning their future together, and I would be watching everything. I'd set up cameras throughout the house before I left, hidden in places David would never think to look, in the bookshelf, in the kitchen cabinet, in the living room lamp, and I'd be monitoring all of it from Janet's house, watching David's reaction when he found me gone, watching what he and Claire did in the days leading up to the funeral, and then on the day of the funeral itself, I would show up. I executed the plan exactly as I designed it. Saturday night went perfectly. I took my switched medication, went to bed, waited until David went downstairs, climbed out the window with an agility I didn't know I still had, drove to Janet's, and the next morning when Janet called David in a panic, I watched through the hidden cameras as David went upstairs, looked around the bedroom, and his face, I'll never forget his face. For just a split second before he started shouting for help, he smiled, a small, quick smile that told me everything I needed to know. He was relieved. He thought it had finally worked. He thought I was actually dead. Dr. Hendricks arrived and played her part perfectly, examining the room, asking David questions about my medication and my symptoms, and pronouncing that I'd most likely suffered a fatal heart attack. David actually cried. He stood there in our bedroom and cried real tears. But I could see through the cameras that they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief, tears of freedom, tears of a man who thought he'd finally gotten what he wanted without having to pay the price. Within an hour, Claire was at the house. She came under the guise of comforting David, of being there for him as a friend. But the cameras caught what happened next as soon as Dr. Hendricks left, and the funeral home had taken away the supposed body, which was actually just weighted bags arranged to look like a body under a sheet. David and Claire sat in my living room drinking my wine and planning their future. I recorded every word. Claire said, "I know this is terrible timing, David, but we need to talk about what happens next." And David replied, "I know, I've been thinking about it. The house is paid off now and Margaret's life insurance is $500,000, plus there's her retirement fund and her savings. We're looking at almost $1 million total." And Claire actually laughed. She laughed and said, "So what you're saying is Margaret was worth more dead than alive?" And David responded, "I'm saying that." We've waited long enough, we've been careful for 2 years now, 2 years of sneaking around. And finally we can be together without hiding, we can sell this house, move somewhere warm like Florida or Arizona, and live the life we've always talked about. 2 years, they'd been having an affair for 2 years. All this time when Claire was coming over for our weekly coffee dates, when she was helping me plan my charity fundraisers, when she was acting like my closest friend, she was sleeping with my husband and planning to take everything I'd worked for my entire life. And David, the man who'd promised to love and cherish me until death do us part, had been actively trying to make that death come sooner. The next 3 days were torture. I watched through the cameras as David played the grieving widower perfectly. He called our children, our son Marcus, who lives in Seattle, and our daughter Jennifer, who's in Boston, and he told them with a shaking voice that their mother had passed away suddenly, that she'd had a heart attack in her sleep, that it was peaceful, that she didn't suffer. And I watched as he comforted them over video calls while Claire sat just off camera. I watched as he went through my closet and my jewelry box with Claire, deciding what to keep and what to sell. Claire actually put on my pearl necklace, the one David had given me for our 20th anniversary, and she looked in the mirror and said, "I've always loved this necklace," and David said, "It's yours now, everything is ours now." I watched as they made love in my bed, in the bed I'd slept in for 43 years, and I felt something inside me that I'd never felt before, not anger exactly, but something colder, something harder, something that made me absolutely certain that what I was about to do was not just justified but necessary. On Tuesday afternoon, David met with the funeral director, my friend who was in on the plan, and finalized the arrangements. The service would be Wednesday at 2 o'clock at Henderson's funeral home, followed by a reception at our house. David had ordered catering. He'd selected flowers, white roses, which were actually Claire's favorite, not mine. He'd even written a eulogy that he planned to deliver. And that night, I listened to him practice it in our bedroom. He stood in front of the mirror and read from a paper. "Margaret was the love of my life," he said. "She was kind and generous and caring. She dedicated her life to helping others, and she will be deeply missed by everyone who knew her." And I almost broke right there. I almost called the whole thing off and called the police, because the lies were so egregious, so complete, so perfectly delivered that I realized he'd become someone I didn't know at all. But then I remembered something else I'd seen on the cameras. I remembered watching David and Claire the night after my supposed death, after they'd drunk my wine and planned their future, after they'd gone upstairs to my bedroom. I watched them lie in my bed, and Claire said to David, "Do you feel guilty at all?" And David was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Honestly, no. Margaret had a good life. She had 43 years of marriage, 2 healthy children, a nice home. She got more than most people get. And if her heart was weak anyway, well, we just helped nature along a little bit." And Claire said, "That's a good way to think about it. We're not bad people, David. We're just people who deserve to be happy too." And David agreed, "We deserve this, Claire. We've sacrificed enough." And I realized then that they had rationalized everything. They had convinced themselves that slowly poisoning me to death was somehow justified, that stealing my money and my life was acceptable because they deserved happiness. And that's when I knew I couldn't back out. I had to see this through. Wednesday morning arrived, the day of my funeral, and I prepared myself for what I was about to do. I put on a black dress, a simple one that I'd bought specifically for this occasion. I did my makeup carefully, not too much because I wanted to look like myself, but enough to look healthy and alive, and Janet drove me to the funeral home. We arrived early before any of the guests, and I hid in a small office that the funeral director had prepared for me. From there I could see the entire chapel. Through a two-way mirror, I could see everything, hear everything, and I had a camera set up to record it all. The guests started arriving around 1:30, our neighbors, our friends from church, members of the charity organizations I'd worked with, and they all looked genuinely sad. Many of them were crying, and I felt guilty for putting them through this, but I also knew that they deserved to know the truth about David. They deserved to know who he really was. David arrived at 1:45 wearing a black suit and a perfectly somber expression. Claire was with him. She'd come as a friend supporting him through his grief, and they sat in the front row next to Marcus and Jennifer, who'd flown in that morning. My children looked devastated, and seeing their pain almost made me stop everything right there, but I knew I couldn't. I had to see this through. The service began at 2 o'clock exactly. There was music, a hymn I'd always loved, and then David stood up to deliver his eulogy. He walked to the podium. looked out at the assembled crowd, and began to speak. Margaret was an extraordinary woman, he said, his voice catching perfectly. She was my partner, my best friend, my everything. We met when we were young and foolish and in love. And that love sustained us through 43 years of marriage, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow. She was the strongest person I've ever known, and I don't know how I'm going to live without her. But I know she'd want me to be strong. She'd want me to carry on her legacy of kindness and service. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to honor her memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted me to live. The crowd was crying, people were nodding, and Claire reached forward and squeezed David's hand in what looked like a supportive gesture. And I watched from my hidden room and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cold, calm certainty about what I needed to do next. After David's eulogy, several other people spoke: our pastor, a friend from my book club, one of my fellow volunteers from the library, and they all said beautiful things about me. They talked about my generosity, my warmth, my dedication to helping others, and with each speech I became more resolved in my plan because these people deserved to know the truth. They deserved to know that they were mourning someone who wasn't actually dead while the person who'd tried to kill her sat in the front row accepting their condolences. Then something happened that I hadn't anticipated. My daughter Jennifer stood up to speak. She hadn't been on the program, but she walked to the podium with tears streaming down her face, and she said, "I need to say something about my mother because I don't think my father's words captured who she really was. My mother was more than kind and generous. She was fierce, she was brave, she never backed down from a challenge. And she taught me that a woman should never let anyone make her feel small or powerless. She taught me to stand up for myself, to fight for what's right. And even though she's gone, I'm going to carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life." And I watched my daughter say these words, and I felt tears in my eyes for the first time since this whole thing started. Because Jennifer understood me in a way that David never had. She knew that I wasn't just a kind, generous woman who did volunteer work. She knew that I had strength, that I had fight in me, and hearing her say those words gave me the final push I needed to walk into that reception and expose everything. The service ended around 3 o'clock, and the funeral director announced that there would be a reception at the Cole residence, and people started filing out to their cars. David and Claire left together with Marcus and Jennifer, and I waited 15 minutes to make sure everyone had gone. Then Janet and I drove to my house using a different route, so we wouldn't be seen. We parked 2 blocks away, and I walked to my own house, to my own funeral reception, carrying with me a folder containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past 6 months: the recordings, the bank statements, the lab analysis of the poison medication, photographs, transcripts, everything. I walked in through the front door at 3:30, just as the reception was in full swing. There were probably 50 people in my living room and dining room, eating the catered food David had ordered, drinking wine, sharing memories of me. And when I walked in, there was a moment, maybe 5 seconds, of absolute silence. People literally froze with drinks halfway to their lips, with food on forks suspended in air. Because they were seeing a ghost, they were seeing a dead woman walk into her own funeral reception. And then someone screamed. I think it was my neighbor Ellen, and then chaos erupted. People were gasping and crying and shouting, and I just stood there calmly waiting for the noise to die down. David saw me and the blood drained from his face. He actually staggered backward and grabbed onto Claire for support. And Claire looked like she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. And my children, my beautiful children, Marcus and Jennifer, came running to me. They were crying and hugging me and asking me if I was real, if this was actually happening. And I held them and told them yes, I was real, I was alive. And I was so sorry for putting them through this, but there was something they needed to know, something everyone needed to know. I asked everyone to please sit down. I said I knew this was shocking, but I needed them to listen to what I had to say, and slowly, like people in a dream, they all found seats or stood against walls, their eyes never leaving me, and I stood in the center of my living room and I told them everything. I told them about coming home early and finding David with Claire. I told them about the money he'd been stealing, about the second mortgage, about the poison medication. I held up the lab report and read from it. This medication contains not only the prescribed blood pressure medication, but also a compound that would slowly weaken the heart over time, leading to heart failure that would appear natural. And I told them how David had been giving me these pills every morning for 6 months, how he'd been slowly trying to kill me, and then I played the recordings. I played the recording from the car where David told Claire, "Once Margaret is gone, we can finally be together." I played the recording from my living room the night they thought I'd died, where Claire said Margaret was worth more dead than alive and David laughed. And I played the recording from just 2 days ago where they were in my bedroom, in my bed, planning their future with my money, discussing selling the house, talking about my life insurance. And with each recording the room got quieter. Until you could hear people breathing. Until the only sound was David and Claire's voices coming from my phone speaker, condemning them with their own words. But I wasn't finished yet. I had one more recording to play, and this was the one that I knew would seal their fate completely. It was from Tuesday night, the night before the funeral, when David and Claire were alone in my house, and they thought no one could hear them. And in this recording David said to Claire, "You know the best part about all this?" And Claire said, "What?" And David said, "Everyone thinks I'm this grieving, devoted husband. They're all feeling sorry for me. They're all bringing me casseroles and offering to help. And meanwhile we're about to be rich and free." And Claire said, "Do you think anyone suspects anything?" And David said, "Are you kidding? Margaret was so trusting, so naive. She never questioned anything I did. She was the perfect Mark." And that's when I stopped the recording. I looked at David and I said, "The perfect Mark, is that what I was to you, David, after 43 years of marriage, after building a life together, after raising 2 children together? I was just a Mark, just someone to be used and discarded." And David tried to speak, but I held up my hand. I said, "No, you had your chance to speak. You spoke at my funeral. You told everyone how much you loved me, how I was the love of your life, and it was all lies, every single word, and now it's my turn to speak and you're going to listen." I told the room full of people about our early years together, how we'd met in college, how David had pursued me relentlessly, how he'd written me love letters and brought me flowers and promised me the world, and how I'd believed him, how I'd trusted him completely. I told them about our wedding day, how David had looked into my eyes and promised to love and cherish me in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part, and how I'd meant those vows with every fiber of my being. And I told them about the years that followed, about working 2 jobs to put David through graduate school, about supporting his career even when it meant sacrificing my own, about being there for him through his father's death, through his failed business venture, through every crisis and challenge, always supporting him, always believing in him, never questioning his love for me. And then I told them about what happened 6 months ago, about coming home early and seeing him with Claire, about the shock and the betrayal, but also about the decision I made in that moment not to be a victim, not to crumble and cry and beg for explanations, but to find out the truth and to get justice. And I told them about everything I'd discovered, the affair that had been going on for 2 years, right under my nose, the money he'd been stealing for even longer, the poison medication that he'd been giving me every single morning with a smile and a kiss on the forehead. And I told them about the plan I'd come up with, the crazy, audacious plan to fake my own death and expose them. And as I spoke, I could see the expressions on people's faces changing from shock to understanding to admiration. When the recordings finished, I looked directly at David and said, "You stood at my funeral and told everyone I was the love of your life. You cried real tears. You accepted condolences from people who truly cared about me. And all of it was a lie. You've been trying to kill me for 6 months. You've been stealing from me for longer than that. And you've been betraying me with my best friend for 2 years. And now everyone knows exactly who you are, not the grieving widower, not the devoted husband, but a would-be murderer and a thief." David tried to speak. He said, "Margaret, please. I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." But his voice was shaking and he couldn't even look at me. And Claire actually tried to run. She headed for the front door, but Marcus blocked her way. And I said, "Claire, don't you want to stay for the rest of the party? After all, you helped plan it. You picked out the flowers, you helped David write his eulogy. The least you can do is stay for the ending." And then I turned to address the whole room. I said, "I want to thank all of you for coming today. I know this isn't the reception you were expecting. You came here to mourn my death, and instead you're witnessing my resurrection. But I needed you all to be here. I needed witnesses. I needed people to hear the truth straight from David and Claire's own mouths. Because if I had just gone to the police with my evidence, they might have found some way to explain it away. They might have hired expensive lawyers and dragged things out for years, but now, with all of you as witnesses, with recordings that you've all heard, there's no way they can talk their way out of this." I pulled out my phone and made one more call, this one to the police. because Dr. Hendricks had already filed a report about the poison medication and the attempted murder, and now that I was publicly alive again, now that there were 50 witnesses who'd heard the recordings and seen the evidence, the police could make arrests. And within 20 minutes 2 police cars pulled up outside my house and officers came in. They arrested David on charges of attempted murder and fraud. They arrested Claire on charges of conspiracy and fraud, and I watched as they were led out of my house in handcuffs. David was crying, real tears this time. Not tears of relief, but tears of a man whose entire carefully constructed plan had just exploded in his face. And Claire was screaming that this wasn't fair, that I'd tricked them, that I was crazy, that they hadn't done anything wrong. And I just stood there with my children on either side of me and watched them go. After the police left with David and Claire, after the patrol cars drove away with their lights flashing, my living room was still full of people, but now instead of a funeral reception it felt like something else, like a celebration maybe, or a trial where justice had been served. People came up to me one by one, some hugging me, some crying, some apologizing for not seeing what David was, and I told them all the same thing. You couldn't have known, he was very good at pretending, but now we all know the truth. My pastor came up to me, he was shaking his head in disbelief, and he said, "Margaret, I have to admit, when you walked in that door my first thought was that I was seeing a miracle, a literal resurrection. And in a way I guess you've been given a second chance at life, and I hope you use it well." And I told him that was exactly what I intended to do. I had been living for other people for so long, living for David, for my children, for my church, for my volunteer organizations, always putting everyone else's needs before my own, but now I was going to live for myself. And that wasn't selfish, that was survival. My children stayed with me that night. We sat in the living room where just hours earlier David and Claire had been planning their future with my money, and we talked for hours. Marcus said, "Mom, I can't believe you did this. You faked your own death. You attended your own funeral. You exposed them in front of everyone. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard." And Jennifer said, "But Mom, weren't you scared? What if something had gone wrong? What if David had found out?" And I told them honestly. Yes, I was terrified. Every moment of the past 6 months I was terrified, but I was more terrified of dying slowly from poison medication while the man I'd trusted for 43 years pretended to love me. I was more terrified of letting them get away with it, of dying and having everyone think David was a devoted husband and Claire was a loyal friend. I was more terrified of the injustice than I was of the risk. Jennifer asked me when I had known for certain that I was going to go through with the plan, and I told her it was when I heard David practicing his eulogy, when I listened to him stand in our bedroom and recite all those beautiful lies about how much he loved me and how devastated he was by my death. That's when I knew I couldn't back down, because if I did, if I just went to the police with my evidence and let them handle it through normal channels, David would have time to prepare his defense, he'd have time to destroy evidence, he'd have time to craft a story that might convince a jury, but by doing it this way, by giving him the rope to hang himself, by recording his own words when he thought he was safe, I guaranteed that there was no defense, no story, no explanation that could save him. Marcus asked if I had any regrets, and I told him yes. One big regret. I regretted putting him and Jennifer through the pain of thinking I was dead. I regretted the 3 days they spent grieving, making funeral arrangements, flying across the country, preparing themselves for a life without their mother. And I told them I had struggled with that part of the plan more than any other. I had almost called it off a dozen times because I couldn't bear the thought of hurting them. But in the end I decided that 3 days of unnecessary grief was better than them spending the rest of their lives not knowing the truth about their father. Better than them thinking he was a devoted husband who'd lost his wife, when in reality, he was a murderer who'd gotten away with it. The next few months were a whirlwind. David and Claire both went to trial. The evidence I'd gathered was overwhelming. The poison medication, the recordings, the financial fraud. David's lawyer tried to argue that he never actually intended to kill me, that the poison medication was just a backup plan he never would have followed through with. But the prosecutor pointed out that he'd been giving it to me every single day for 6 months, that my heart was already showing signs of damage from it, that if I hadn't discovered what he was doing I would likely have died within another 6 months. And the jury didn't buy his excuse. They convicted him on all charges: attempted murder, fraud, theft, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At age 73, that was essentially a life sentence. Claire's trial was shorter. She was convicted of conspiracy and fraud, but not attempted murder since she hadn't directly participated in the poisoning. She got 10 years. And when she was sentenced she looked at me across the courtroom and said, "I thought you were my friend." And I said back, Claire, I was your friend. For 50 years I was your friend. I was there for you through everything. And you repaid me by sleeping with my husband and helping him try to kill me. So no, we're not friends. Anymore, we'll never be friends again. And then she said something that shocked me. She said, you always thought you were better than everyone else, Margaret. You always acted so perfect, so moral, and David and I were just trying to find some happiness. And I realized in that moment that she had absolutely no remorse. She had convinced herself that she was the victim in this story, that I was somehow the villain for exposing her and David. And I felt a kind of pity for her then, because she would spend the next 10 years in prison never understanding what she'd done wrong. The divorce was finalized while David was in prison. I got everything, the house, the money he'd stolen which had to be repaid from his family's assets, my full retirement fund, and he got nothing except a prison cell and the knowledge that his perfect plan had failed spectacularly. The life insurance he'd been counting on went back to listing me as the beneficiary with Marcus and Jennifer as contingent beneficiaries, and the second mortgage he'd taken out was declared fraudulent since I hadn't signed for it. So that was erased too. I'm 71 years old now. It's been 8 months since my fake funeral, since I walked into that reception and exposed David and Claire in front of everyone we knew, and people still talk about it. I've become something of a local legend, the woman who attended her own funeral, the woman who caught her cheating husband by pretending to be dead, and sometimes people ask me if I regret it, if I think I should have just gone to the police right away instead of staging such an elaborate plan. And I tell them no, I don't regret it at all, because going to the police right away would have meant trials and investigations, and he said she said arguments. It would have meant David and Claire would have had time to destroy evidence and coordinate their stories. By doing it the way I did, by giving them the chance to reveal their true selves when they thought no one was watching, I got irrefutable proof. I got their own words condemning them. And more than that, I got the satisfaction of seeing their faces when they realized they'd lost, when they realized that the weak old woman they thought they could manipulate and murder had outsmarted them completely. I still live in the same house. I've redecorated, of course, gotten rid of everything that reminded me of David, and I've made it my own space now. My children visit regularly. Marcus and Jennifer both said they're proud of me for standing up for myself even though the way I did it was crazy. And I've made new friends, real friends who appreciate me for who I am, not for what I can give them. And I've taken up painting, something I always wanted to do, but never had time for when I was busy being the perfect wife. I've also started traveling. I went to Paris last month, something I'd always dreamed of doing, but David never wanted to go. He always said it was too expensive, too much trouble, but now I realize he just didn't want to spend money on something for me. He was saving it all for his future with Claire. Sometimes late at night I think about David and Claire in their separate prisons. I think about what their lives are like now compared to what they thought their lives would be. They thought they'd be on a beach in Florida drinking Mai Tais and living off my life insurance money. Instead, they're in 8x10 cells eating prison food and counting the years until they might be free again, if they ever are. And I know it's not very Christian of me, but I hope they think about me every single day. I hope they remember my face when I walked into that funeral reception. I hope they remember the moment they realized I'd won. People sometimes ask me what the hardest part was, and I tell them it wasn't the planning or the risk or even the fear of being caught. The hardest part was watching my children's pain when they thought I was dead, seeing Marcus and Jennifer crying at my funeral, believing they'd lost their mother. That was the one part of the plan I truly regret, but when I explained to them afterward why I did it, why it was necessary, they understood. Jennifer said, "Mom, if you'd just confronted him, he might have killed you for real. At least this way you controlled the situation." And she was right. By taking control, by refusing to be a victim, I saved my own life. I volunteer at a women's shelter now. I help women who are in abusive relationships, who are being manipulated or controlled or worse. And I tell them my story not to encourage them to fake their own deaths, but to show them that they're not powerless, that no matter how dire the situation seems, there's always a way out if you're brave enough and smart enough to find it. And many of these women tell me I've inspired them to leave, to start over, to reclaim their lives, and that makes everything I went through worth it. I meet women who've been told by their husbands or boyfriends that they're worthless, that no one else would want them, that they couldn't survive on their own, and I tell them those are the exact same lies I believed for years, the lies that keep women trapped in toxic relationships. and I show them that a 71-year-old woman with high blood pressure and no job managed to outsmart two people who were trying to destroy her, so they can certainly find the strength to leave their situations too. One woman in particular stands out to me. Her name was Rachel, and she was 38 years old with 3 children, and her husband had been financially abusing her for years. He controlled all the money, gave her an allowance like she was a child, checked every receipt, questioned every purchase, and he'd convinced her that she was too stupid to manage money on her own, that without him she'd end up homeless. And when she came to the shelter, she was broken. She truly believed she couldn't survive without him. But I sat with her, and I showed her the bank statements I'd gathered during my investigation. I showed her how David had been stealing from me for years and I hadn't noticed because I'd trusted him. And I said, Rachel, you're not stupid. You're trusting. And there's a difference. Trusting someone doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But now that you know what's happening, now that your eyes are open, you have power. And over the next few months, I watched Rachel transform. She got a job. She learned to manage her own money. She filed for divorce. And the last time I saw her, she looked like a completely different person, confident, strong, in control of her own life. And she told me, Margaret, you saved me. And I said, no, Rachel, you saved yourself. I just showed you it was possible. I'm writing a book about my experience. A publisher approached me after the trial made national news. The woman who attended her own funeral was apparently a story that captured people's imaginations. And I'm working with a writer to tell the full story, everything I've told you and more. And the working title is The Woman Who Died Twice. Once when I trusted the wrong people, and once when I decided to take my life back. And I hope when it's published it will help other people in similar situations realize they have options, they have strength, they have the power to change their circumstances no matter how impossible it seems. The book goes into even more detail about the planning process, about the psychological toll of watching your own husband plan your life without you, about the moment-by-moment decisions I had to make during those 3 days when I was supposedly dead, and about what happened after, the trials, the media attention, the rebuilding of my life. The writer I'm working with, her name is Amanda and she's in her 40s. She told me that when she first heard my story she didn't believe it. She thought it had to be exaggerated or made up because it seemed too perfectly orchestrated to be real. But then she met with me, reviewed all my evidence, listened to all the recordings, and she said, Margaret, this is the most incredible story I've ever heard. Not just because of what you did, but because of why you did it. Most revenge stories are about anger or hatred, but yours is about justice and self-preservation. You didn't do this to hurt David and Claire. You did it to protect yourself and expose the truth. And that's what makes it so powerful. We've been working on the book for 6 months now, meeting once a week at my house. And Amanda asks me questions that make me think about things I haven't thought about in years, like why did I stay with David for so long? Were there warning signs I missed? Did I ever suspect something was wrong before I caught them together? And the truth is, yes, there were signs. There were moments over the years when David seemed distant or distracted. Times when he was overly critical of me. Times when he seemed annoyed by my presence. But I explained them away. I told myself he was stressed from work, tired from the commute, worried about money. I made excuses for him because I loved him and I wanted to believe our marriage was solid. And Amanda says that's exactly what most people do. They see the red flags, but they convince themselves everything is fine because accepting the truth is too painful. One chapter of the book focuses specifically on the moment I decided to fake my death, instead of just confronting David. And Amanda wanted to understand my thought process. She said, Margaret, most people in your situation would have either confronted their spouse immediately or gone straight to the police. Why did you choose this elaborate plan instead? And I told her it was because I knew David. I'd been married to him for 43 years, and I knew how he operated. He was charming, he was convincing, he could talk his way out of almost anything. If I had confronted him, he would have denied everything. He would have made me feel crazy for suspecting him. He would have convinced me I was overreacting. And even if I had gone to the police with the evidence I had at that point, the poison medication and the recordings, he would have hired the best lawyers his family's money could buy, and he might have gotten away with it. But by faking my death, by giving him exactly what he wanted and then watching what he did with it, I trapped him completely. He had no defense against his own words, his own actions, his own celebrations of my death. Another chapter focuses on the 3 days between my supposed death and the funeral, And this was the hardest part to write because it required me to relive watching David and Claire through those hidden cameras. Amanda asked me to describe in detail what I saw, what I felt, and it was difficult because during those 3 days I saw my entire marriage in a new light. I saw David going through my things with Claire, laughing about my clothes, my jewelry, my collections, things I'd cherished that they saw as junk to be disposed of. I saw them planning their future in my house, in my bed, with my money, and I saw that David wasn't even pretending to grieve when he was alone with Claire. The tears were only for the cameras, for the phone calls with our children, for the visits with friends and neighbors, but when it was just the two of them he was happy, relieved, excited, and that hurt more than the affair itself. The fact that he felt nothing, absolutely nothing, for the woman he'd spent 43 years with. But Amanda also pushed me to examine my own role in what happened. She asked difficult questions like, did I enable David's behavior by being too trusting? Did I ignore warning signs because I was afraid of being alone? Did I stay in an unhappy marriage because of what other people would think? And these questions made me uncomfortable because the answer to some of them was yes. I did ignore signs, I did make excuses, I did prioritize appearances over honesty, but I also realized that none of that justified what David did. Nothing I did or didn't do made it okay for him to try to murder me, to steal from me, to betray me with my best friend, and Amanda agreed. She said the point isn't to blame you, Margaret. The point is to help other women recognize these patterns in their own lives before it's too late. The book also includes interviews with Dr. Hendricks and my sister Janet, the two people who helped me execute the plan, and their perspectives add another dimension to the story. Dr. Hendricks talks about the ethical dilemma she faced. As a doctor, she's supposed to preserve life, not help someone fake their death, but she felt that in this case the ends justified the means, that by helping me she was actually saving my life, because if David had continued giving me that poison medication I would have died within months. And she talks about the fear she felt that something would go wrong, that David would discover the plan, that I would be hurt or worse. And she says that the 3 days when I was supposedly dead were the longest 3 days of her life because she was constantly worried that David might do something unpredictable. Janet's interview is particularly emotional because she talks about what it was like to watch her sister go through this, to see me broken and betrayed but also determined and strong. And she talks about the night I showed up at her house with my plan, how she thought I'd completely lost my mind, how she tried to talk me out of it, but also how she ultimately supported me because she knew that I needed to do this my way. And she talks about those 3 days when I was staying with her, watching the cameras, monitoring David's every move, and she says she'd never seen me so focused, so determined, so absolutely certain that I was doing the right thing, and she knew then that I was going to succeed because when Margaret Cole sets her mind to something, Janet says in the book, there's no stopping her. The book will be published next spring, and we're already getting interest from movie producers who want to turn it into a film, which is surreal to me because I never imagined my life would become public entertainment. But Amanda says stories like mine are important because they show women that they don't have to be victims, that they can fight back, that they can win. And if turning my experience into a movie helps even one woman find the courage to leave an abusive situation, then it will be worth it. I've already been approached by several actresses who want to play me. Women in their 60s and 70s who say they're drawn to the role because it shows an older woman as strong, capable, and strategic rather than weak and vulnerable. And I find that validating because that's exactly how I want to be remembered, not as a victim who was betrayed by her husband, but as a survivor who took control of her own story. I've also been invited to speak at various events, women's conferences, survivor groups, even a few churches, and I always tell the same story, but I try to tailor it to the audience. When I speak to women who are currently in abusive relationships, I focus on the warning signs I missed, the red flags I ignored, and I encourage them to trust their instincts, to document everything, to make plans. When I speak to older women, I focus on the fact that it's never too late to start over. That age doesn't make you powerless, that the wisdom and experience we gain over the years can actually be our greatest weapons. And when I speak to younger women, I focus on the importance of maintaining your independence, of keeping your own bank accounts, of having your own friends and interests separate from your partner, because I lost all of that over the years, and it made me vulnerable. The most common question I get at these events is always the same: would you do it again? And my answer is always yes, absolutely yes, because the alternative was letting David get away with attempted murder, letting him inherit my money, letting him live happily ever after with Claire while I was dead and buried, and I wasn't willing to let that happen. Some people think what I did was extreme, that I could have achieved the same result by just going to the police, but I disagree. By faking my death, I controlled the narrative, I gathered irrefutable evidence, I exposed David and Claire in a way that made it impossible for them to deny or minimize what they'd done, and I did it all on my terms, not on the terms of the police or the courts or the legal system. And that matters more than people realize. I've also heard from David's family. His brother called me a few months after the trial and apologized. He said he'd always known David had a selfish streak, but he never imagined he was capable of something like this. And he wanted me to know that the family supported me completely, that they believed me, that they thought David deserved everything he got. And that meant something to me because I'd been worried that David's family would turn against me, would blame me somehow, but instead, they've been nothing but supportive. David's brother even offered to help me financially if I needed it, which I appreciated but declined because I have everything I need now. Claire's family, on the other hand, has been silent. Her sister sent me one brief email saying she didn't know what to believe, that Claire had always been a good person, and she couldn't reconcile that with what I was accusing her of, and I wrote back and said I understand. It's hard to believe someone you love is capable of terrible things. But the evidence speaks for itself. Listen to the recordings, look at the bank statements, and then decide what you believe, and I never heard back from her. And that's fine, I don't need Claire's family to believe me. I have 50 witnesses who saw me walk into that funeral reception, who heard the recordings, who saw David and Claire's reactions, and that's enough. Marcus and Jennifer have both struggled with what happened in different ways. Marcus is angry. He's angry at David for what he did, angry at himself for not seeing it, angry at the situation, and he's been in therapy working through it. And I'm proud of him for that, for recognizing that he needs help processing this trauma. Jennifer, on the other hand, is sad more than angry. She mourns the father she thought she had, the family she thought we were, and she's had to completely rewrite her understanding of her childhood. Were there signs even then that David was capable of this? Was he ever genuinely happy with me, or was our entire marriage a lie? And I've tried to help her understand that the past was real, that the love I had for her and Marcus was real, that the family moments we shared were real. The only thing that wasn't real was David's commitment to our marriage, and that doesn't erase the good memories. It just adds context to them. Both of my children have asked me about dating, whether I would ever consider being in a relationship again, and my answer is I don't know. Right now I'm enjoying being on my own, making my own decisions, not having to consider anyone else's needs or wants. But I'm not opposed to the idea of companionship in the future. If I met someone who respected me, who valued me for who I am rather than what I have, who didn't try to control or manipulate me, then maybe I'd consider it, but I'm also perfectly content being alone. I've learned that being alone and being lonely are two very different things. I was lonely in my marriage with David even though I was never alone. But now I'm alone much of the time and I'm rarely lonely. I have my children, my friends, my volunteer work, my painting, my writing, and that's enough. I think about the future a lot now, about what I want to do with the years I have left. I'm 71 years old, and in good health now that I'm not being slowly poisoned. And I could realistically have another 20 years or more, and I want to make them count. I want to travel, to see the places I've always dreamed of. I want to spend time with my children and eventually my grandchildren. Marcus and his wife are trying to have a baby and Jennifer is getting serious with her partner. And I want to be there for those moments. I want to be the grandmother who shows up, who's present, who's engaged, not like David was as a father, distant and self-absorbed. I want to create new memories that aren't tainted by betrayal and lies. I've also thought about forgiveness. People ask me if I've forgiven David and Claire, and the honest answer is no, not yet, maybe not ever, and I don't feel guilty about that. Forgiveness is supposed to be about letting go of anger and moving on, but I'm not holding on to anger. I'm holding on to truth. I'm holding on to the knowledge of what they did and what they're capable of, and I don't need to forgive them to move forward with my life. I've already moved forward. I'm thriving, I'm happy, I'm free. And that's its own kind of liberation. Forgiveness might come someday, or it might not, and either way I'm okay with it. What I do feel is gratitude for the friends who helped me, for Dr. Hendricks and Janet, who risked their own reputations to support my plan, Gratitude for my children who've stood by me through this entire ordeal. Gratitude for the women at the shelter who've shared their stories with me and let me be part of their healing. Gratitude for the legal system that actually worked the way it was supposed to for once. And gratitude for my own strength, my own resilience, my own refusal to be a victim. I could have let this destroy me. I could have crumbled when I found David with Claire. I could have taken those poisoned pills until they killed me. But I didn't. I fought back. I survived. I won, and that's something to be grateful for. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. See you in the next life story.